This is a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to talk a little bit about a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and hopefully it's going to bring some ideas that will help spur conversation through the afternoon. I think we all know intuitively that our transportation economy runs on oil, and whether it's planes or trains or boats or automobiles or trucks or freight, it's all dependent on our availability of a reliable source of oil at affordable prices. And so what I thought I would do today, since I was asked to talk a little bit about economic issues and economic forecasts and economic considerations for planning our future transportation economy, I thought that I would spend really my bulk of my time talking about the economics of oil and the oil economy and how it might shape or color decisions that you make, decisions that we make together as a society about our future transportation economy. You often hear the politicians talk about reducing our reliance on foreign oil, and the implication, I guess, in those speeches that I've heard since I was in high school, going back to Richard Nixon, I think every single president promised to reduce our reliance on foreign oil, and every single president has seen an administration where we've had increasingly dependence on foreign oil. And here are some of the fundamentals of United States consumption and its production and its net imports. The key problem with domestic oil is that the gold line in the middle is that production of domestic oil continues to fall. And that's because basic supply and demand, no matter how sophisticated our drilling techniques, no matter how sophisticated our exploration techniques, no matter how deep we go or how ambitiously we look for it, we don't produce more oil, we produce less. So therefore our imports continue to go up. The dip in imports and the dip in consumption is primarily driven by the recession of 2008, and we'll look a little bit more about that. So the idea that we can produce our way to energy independence is a false notion. The forecast, this is official international forecasts from the Energy Information Agency World Energy Production System, estimating how much energy the world is going to need in total going forward. And this is not just oil, this is total aggregate energy of all types. And I just show this to suggest that even though the world is getting more efficient, we're producing more gross national product, gross global product per unit of energy every year. The economy gets more and more and more efficient. Still, the demand for energy is expected to grow going forward. And these are the what I would call the business as usual forecasts. Now, what I always like to point out is that doesn't mean they're right. They're just one set of analysis of growing output of energy from the various sources, from the bottom up: nuclear power, renewable energy, natural gas, coal, and liquids. You'll hear me talk a little bit in this talk about liquids. That really combines all liquid fuels in one category, whether it's oil, gasoline, different fuels derived from oil, like gasoline or propane or kerosene, or even biofuels or liquid natural gas. Those are all liquids. Now I'm going to show this slide now, and I'm going to show it again at the end in order to make this point more dramatically. The United States Department of Energy in 2009 published this set of data, which I thought was really remarkable because there never had been this clarity from the Department of Energy ever before. And these are really, from the bottom going up, these are all the different major blocks of oil production globally. The existing OPEC conventional and non-OPEC conventional oil are the red and the blue bands. And then the next ones are OPEC projects that are pending, that are not in production but pending, or ramping up, and then non-OPEC projects that are pending is the gold and the purple, and then all the other sources of oil or liquids that you hear debated about, whether it's unconventional petroleum liquids such as Canadian oil sands or tar sands, or biofuels is the green band, non-petroleum conventional liquids. They're all projected to grow in their totals, but because the OPEC and the non-OPEC conventional oil sources are expected to decline and demand is expected to continue to rise, the Department of Energy had to call the gap unidentified projects, which I thought was sort of hilarious, that the official word from your federal Department of Energy is, as of 2012, they basically don't know where the liquid fuels are coming from. They're unidentified projects. So who's consuming oil globally in 2007 and in 2035? The light blue bar is by region of the world, who's consuming what oil now, and the dark blue bar is who's projected to be consuming what oil in 2035. And you can see that the big dominant play here is that the tiger of China and India are expected to use dramatically more liquid fuels, dramatically more oil and oil derivatives in 2035 than they are now, almost double, whereas North America is expected just to use a little bit more. And some other countries are expected to use a little bit less, like Europe, and the rest of Asia are expected to use a little less. And even though countries like in African countries are expected to use more, they're certainly not going to be driving the global oil markets. And then I think it's also interesting to know who's actually got the oil left in the world. I always read this in order and skip one country and come back to it. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Venezuela, Russia, Libya, Nigeria are top 10 countries in the world that have proven oil reserves. And of those countries, only one, the Canadians at number 2, they're the only country in the top 10 who are a stable democracy that's friendly to the United States interests. So some of them are friendly to the United States interests, some of them are democracies, some of them may be stable, but they're difficult places to do business with if you want to rely on these countries for your energy economy and your energy security. So Canada is a special case. We're going to talk a little bit at the end of the presentation about Canada. Canada has the second largest proven oil reserves in the world, which is the good news. But the bad news is that the Canadians' oil is tied up in very low-grade oil product, often called oil sands or tar sands, that requires an enormous amount of energy to extract it, enormous amount of energy to separate the sand from the oil, an enormous amount of energy to get it to market. So we're going to look a little bit at that at the end. And again, if you map by region, if you map all those countries by region who has proven oil reserves, the Middle East countries have more oil than all the rest of the countries in the world combined. So, despite the vast oil resources of the Canadians, really the only country in the top 10 with proven oil reserves, the Middle East countries that we're seeing in the news every day have more oil than all the rest of the world combined. Well, here's the fundamental truth of the matter. And the phrase peak oil has been a little bit pilloried over the last decade. I have not always used that term because it's been controversial, but the truth is that it's here now or soon. And that's the range of debate among the experts, is whether we're about now at the point where global oil production is going to begin to decline, or whether it's maybe a few years off. But the range of debate is no longer that global oil production would continue to rise until 2020 or 2030 or 2040, which was the business as usual assumption that we had not very long ago. So here again is another way to look at all the sources of oil in the world. The United States at the bottom in the lower 48, and then the Europeans, and then the Russians, then Middle East. Then the dark gray band is what you would call the heavy oils. This would include the tar sands and other oil derivatives from low-value bitumen kind of products. And you see that band is getting wider. So in other words, there'll be big expansions of oil from that, but it isn't anywhere near to keep up with the decline of all those other conventional sources. And then deep water drilling, which we had obviously a lot of controversy about last summer, but there really is no doubt that we're going to continue to do deep water drilling. And it is going to be a big explosion in, oh, that's a poorly chosen word, it's going to be a significant expansion in the amount of oil we get from deep water drilling, but it's only for a short time, and then it tapers off too. And the band at the top is natural gas liquids. So we're going to be seeing a lot of reliance on natural gas liquids. But the obvious most important thing about this chart is the shape of the chart, which is why they use the phrase peak oil, that liquids for running automobiles are not going to be as plentiful going forward as they were historically, but demand is continuing to rise. And here's another interesting way I like to look at this. This is a very interesting chart. I think it's very, very persuasive. This is a bar chart of oil discoveries year by year, going back to 1930. And I think it's interesting that the year that the world discovered the most oil ever was 1964. That's the highest bar on the chart. I think the one prior to that, the second highest year is like 1947, I believe. And that's when the great oil fields of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and all that were discovered. I mean, these are really unbelievably massive oil fields that were discovered in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And so here we have currently, the absolute most advanced exploration technology that science and engineering could devise, with magnetic resonance of places in the earth that we can't even imagine being or seeing. We have all this incredibly advanced technology for finding oil, but we're finding oil at a lesser and lesser and lesser amount all the time. And if you compare that, the black line, which is the global oil production, you can see that where global oil production is today versus global oil discovery is today, we're only discovering a teeny fraction of the oil that we're producing on a year-by-year basis. And every year, the production on these business as usual graphs, the one I showed you where production just keeps going up and up and up, it doesn't account for the fact that we're not finding any more oil. So even with all the environmental controversies about oil, and we can tick them off, offshore drilling in the polar regions, drilling in Anwar, the concerns about the heavy tar sands oil. Even with all those controversies aside, we're just not discovering oil at anywhere near the rate that we're producing it. So in other words, no matter where people fall on those classic environmental debates, it doesn't really matter that, the gap is the gap. And we're basically, what we're doing is we're mining the mother lode that we found 50 years ago. That's what we're consuming, is the oil that we found 50 years ago, not the oil that we're finding now. And the yellow is a projection of oil discoveries going out. And every oil person in the world would be absolutely have their mind blown if we discovered oil at the rate we were discovering it in 2000 or in 1990. We're not going to be discovering more oil like that. So here's a very interesting chart, the price of oil. This really affects economics quite a bit. The price of oil from 1946 to 2009, the black line is the nominal price of oil, and I actually have a next slide that brings it up to date. The red line is the inflation-adjusted oil price. So you can see that when you adjust for inflation, the high oil prices we're having now and had a little earlier in the 2000s were not unprecedented. The oil prices in the late 70s and early 80s on an inflation-adjusted basis was as high. But what you can see is from 1995 to 2008, you can see the steady and rapid increase in oil prices globally. And you can have arguments about this, and a lot of smart people might have different opinions. You know, is there speculation? Is, you know, are blah, 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 is it OPEC? But fundamental story is it's a supply and demand problem, is that we have, you know, the Chinese economy exploding at the very time that world oil discoveries are rapidly dropping off. So demand is going up rapidly, and new discoveries are going down. And this is the last few years. In fact, I think this is this is data that's current as of Friday. You know, we had quite the oil price shock in the September of 2008. And again, could have debates about whether it was speculation or supply and demand, or what fraction of it was which. But the truth of the matter is that oil got to $149 a barrel, and that was one of the factors that precipitated the collapse of the economy in September of that year. You know, most of the press goes to all the mortgages that people had that were unsustainable and were unaffordable. But in part, the reasons those mortgages were unsustainable, unaffordable, is people were paying $4 of gasoline to drive from the outer edge of the, you know, the fringe exurbs into their job that was clear across the metro area, and they were thinking, you know, 45 miles each way, $4, you know, and then their mortgage started to look more and more like a problem. They bought that mortgage because it was the best value they could get, but they didn't factor in what was going to be the price of oil. So then we had a collapse of oil prices. In 2009, oil prices dropped back to where they were in 2003, 2004, back to $30. But this is a key point, is here we are in the worst economic recession since the 30s, and oil prices have steadily climbed back up to $100 a barrel. So from September of 2008, when they crashed and dropped through the floor, to where we are today, oil prices have gone from $30 a barrel, which was $30 a barrel. See, look at it, never got above $30 a barrel in nominal oil prices. It never got above $30 a barrel except for once or twice. You know, going back 50 years, it basically stayed under $30 a barrel until about 2000. And now $30 a barrel is a distant fond memory. See what I'm saying? Because we're now at $100 a barrel, and the economy hasn't fully recovered. So tell me what the price of oil is going to be when the economy fully recovers. The Chinese and Indian and Asian demand is going through the roof, and we're not discovering new oil. What is going to be the price of oil? So already what we pay for oil is largely driven by the price of crude. If you look at the average, the first gas pump closest to me is the average price of gasoline from 2000 to 2009, and roughly half the price of the gasoline you bought was crude oil, and the other half the price of gasoline was the refinery and the distribution and the marketing and government taxes. Well, last year it was closer to 2/3. It was above 2/3, almost 70%. So it's the crude oil prices obviously driving the gasoline prices, and we're not going to see a time anytime soon where half the cost of gasoline is crude oil. So this is another way to look at the same data of China driving the increased consumption. I think this is a very interesting little chart. It took me a little while to stare at it to figure it out. But the silver blue in the middle is the United States. Whether you're above the line or below the line is the change in consumption from the prior year. So let's just take a look at 2008, for example. In 2008, U.S. consumption was dramatically lower than in 2007. That's why the big shiny blue box below the line. And what you can see here is that in every year, 2004 to 2012, in every year, the China demand is above the line. There's increased demand, so they didn't have any decline in consumption during the recession. During the session, they increased their consumption of oil the same as they did in 2008, as in 2007, 2005, 2006. They're all comparable. But now look at 2010 and 2011 and 2012. The thickness of the bluest bar, the China bar, is way thicker than the American bar, and the China bar is comparable to the rest of the world. So in other words, the increased consumption of oil is being driven by the Chinese economy. And there's nothing really that can change that fundamentally. We live in a global economy, and the price of oil is set globally. And the Chinese have showed up at the oil guzzling party right when oil is running out, is the reality. So, we are fortunate to be immediately south of Canada, and Canada oil sands production has been the main driver in making the United States the largest supplier by far. Canada is the largest supplier by far of foreign oil in the United States. A lot of people don't know that when you talk about imported oil, the biggest oil imports we have are Canadian. And the projection is that Canadian oil imports are going to grow quite rapidly, and they could be as much as triple or quadruple in 20 years. But the problem with Canadian oil is the environmental problem. And this is the landscape of a boreal forest prior to the extraction of the oil on the photograph next to me, and then the landscape after the extraction of oil is on the right. Now they are making innovations and improvements where they have developed some additional methods, and some fraction of the oil is not currently being extracted with this surface mining method. But it's a pretty crude way to get crude, is to put it in trucks and track it across the landscape and rinse it with boiling solvents that you use natural gas to boil, and then store the solvents in a pond. The amount of solvents and water that are stored in above surface earthen dams in Alberta, Canada, basically they were designed as temporary storage while they figure out an engineering solution for these toxic waters. The amount of water being stored in these earthen dams is 3 times the size of Lake Minnetonka. Like a lot of water. I'm not saying it's 3 times the volume, I'm saying it's 3 times the surface area as Lake Minnetonka. So the crude oil production from Alberta rose from 600,000 barrels a day to 1.35 million barrels a day over the last 10 years. And one industry observer, Cambridge Energy Research Associates, they're well regarded, predicts that we might get as much as 6 million barrels a day. And just to give you a sense, the total amount of recoverable oil from tar sands is expected to be about 170 million barrels a day. That would require the extraction of oil from a geography about the size of Michigan in northern Alberta. And yesterday, the New York Times ran a lead editorial on this subject, opposing the Keystone XL pipeline. And a Canadian oil economist at the University of Alberta, whose blog I read pretty religiously, he's basically telling his friends and associates in the Canadian oil industry that boosterism and PR and billboards is not going to solve these problems, that they have to really tackle the water quality problems, the landscape problems, the toxin problems, because the general American public isn't aware that this is where their energy security is coming from. So I go back to this data that I showed you again, and point out that that energy security or energy reliability that the Canadians are promising is really the pale pink bar above the purple bar, which is let's see, what is it here? It's the non-OPEC. It's the sky blue bar above the purple bar. It's the non-OPEC unconventional petroleum liquids. So the only reason I point it out again is that even though they're proposing to triple or quadruple or even quintuple the amount of oil that comes out of tar sands in Alberta, it doesn't change the fundamental realities of global oil supply. It's not like it can make it up. So they do have to deal with those serious environmental problems in Alberta, which is where our oil comes from. But even if it was coming on a white pillow and every environmental issue was addressed, it wouldn't change the fundamentals of what's going on globally on supply and demand with oil. That's my message for you. So how did I do on time so far? I have a few more thoughts.
Yes, you've got time. 10 more minutes.
About 10 more minutes. So let me just think out loud. As they said, that was the end of my prepared remarks. But what I want you to think about is how do consumers, how does society, how does government, how does the Department of Transportation respond to the physical reality of the planet? The amount of oil that's left and the price it will be. Now, the problem with this analysis is that we don't know what price it will be. You can't get an oil economist up here to tell you what the price will be. And the reason is because as the price, and there's a great book out by Jeffrey Rubin, who's the oil economist for the Canadian Royal Bank, and he's wrote a wonderful book, said Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller, is the name of his book. And his argument is that just like we saw in 2008 when oil prices kind of peaked at $149, at some point the economy can't take it anymore, and the economy drops. And then oil prices go back to 30. And then what happens is that the economy starts recovering and oil prices start coming back up again. But then maybe they'll reach a new peak this time. Maybe they'll go to $175 a barrel. But then the economy is going to tank again. And then so maybe then the new low will be 60. Instead of 30, it'll be 60. And then the cycle will occur again. So I'm not going to come up here and say to you, oil will never, ever be below $100 a barrel again. I'm not going to say that. Because when the economy staggers, then demand falls and oil prices go down. And that's one of the problems of the whole, what I call the innovation economy, which is all the different things we can do instead of running our cars on oil, is whether you're making advanced biofuels from agricultural wastes or sugar cane or straw or corn cobs, kind of the next generation of biofuels. You don't know what the price of oil is that you have to beat. Because today it's $100, but tomorrow it could be 50. So you can't plan your capital investments, you can't plan your economics, and then people rag on the farmers because they have public subsidies. Well, they have public subsidies because they're competing with this commodity that's, like unpredictable. The other thing is that we're all talking about running our cars on electricity now. You can get a Chevy Volt or a Nissan Leaf today that plug your car in your garage, and it's like buying gasoline at 75 cents a gallon. It's absolutely true. If you buy electricity at the average retail price of electricity from the utilities that serve Minnesota, it's equivalent to buying gasoline at 75 cents a gallon. Well, most consumers will buy gasoline at 75 cents a gallon with a lot of enthusiasm, but there's a lot of infrastructure issues and a lot of cost issues and concerns about a car that runs on electricity. People have range anxiety is a phrase I hear. It's like, yeah, you can probably figure out exactly what range anxiety is. Okay, look at my right? So there's a lot of infrastructure questions. But what I want to ask all of you to think about is a world that is a prosperous, high performance, high capacity, pro-business kind of world that doesn't run on oil. That's the challenge. And obviously oil is not going to disappear. No, if anybody says that oil is running out, correct them, say no, production of oil is beginning to decline. We probably have 100 years worth of oil left, but it's going to go in the same shape that we went up, it'll go in the same shape down. So there'll be oil, it'll just be that people won't be able to afford to use it. And so what will happen, in my judgment, what will happen is the poorest of the poor will stop driving. And they'll require more public transit and more public services and more public amenities. And the cities will grow in population, would be my guess, that the exurban areas will stop growing in population and the cities will grow. And there'll be a big investment in new transit-oriented development where people can, instead of have 3 cars for their family, they have 1 car and the kids use transit and there's the light rail and the buses. And there'll be more investment in that kind of opportunity. And big freeways and big freeway interchanges will be less a priority. And biking and transit friendly and electric car friendly. And I mean, the only reason an electric car is terrifying is if I have to drive 100 miles and I only have a range of 80. If I'm only driving 40 miles and I have a range of 80, then I got room to spare. So more compact development might be warranted. So I think it's probably, I don't know if maybe someone correct me, I never really studied transportation planning, but I sort of have a hunch that people assume that there'll be cars and assume there'll be gasoline. And so what if there's cars, but gasoline it's not really worth it? It's too expensive to be part of the family budget, or maybe you want to have gasoline part of the family budget, but less gasoline. And, will the family have transportation choices? Will the family have transportation options that they can still keep their quality of life high, but they will be able to substitute alternatives for gasoline? So I think that's the planner's dilemma, is looking at this data and looking at the world that's coming and thinking, how can Minnesota be a first-class transportation hub, a first-class business center, a first-class place to live, and have our eye on the ball that it's going to be a world that runs on less gasoline. It's not going to be a world without gasoline, but it's going to be a world that runs on declining amounts of gasoline. And it's going to be supply and demand that determines it. We are definitely not going to have quick and easy substitutes for jet fuel. We're still going to run our planes on jets. We're still going to run our jets on jet fuel. So maybe we'll be looking at, well, how can we substitute electricity in rail? How can we substitute electricity in light rail? How can we substitute electricity for commuting? How can we substitute electricity for, around the neighborhood? How can we substitute bicycling for our Saturday errands? Those are questions that are going to be economically logical questions that families are asking each other. Well, honey, if we had 2 really well-tuned bicycles and one of them had a trailer, we would be able to have 1 car. We wouldn't have to have both. People are going to be asking those questions of each other at the kitchen table. So I just put the challenge out for the transportation planners and the transportation visionaries to think about what that world might look like and help us chart a course. With that, I thank you.
Questions. Remember to state your name and where you're from before you ask your question, and that we'll have volume this time, yes. Joe? Okay. So, go ahead.
Charles Marone with Strong Towns. Awesome presentation. Just to let you hit one out of the park, we have found, 4 Saudi Arabias of oil in North Dakota? Isn't that the report I just read? So how come we're not going to be driving cars forever if we have so much oil just in the next state?
Well, actually, I think the proven oil reserves in North Dakota are like the 4th largest oil reserves of any U.S. state, after Texas, Alaska, Louisiana, then North Dakota. And the idea that the North Dakotans have anything remotely approaching what the Saudis have is not true. What North Dakota has is very, very, very good for the North Dakota economy. But what North Dakota has is a spit in the wind for the global economy. It completely doesn't change the game of what's going on. And the idea that North Dakota is nearby is really irrelevant to us, because North Dakota's goal is to get its oil to the global market at whatever clearing price there is. So it doesn't give us any security, that the North Dakota economy is booming with, oil opportunities, it doesn't help Minnesota's situation at all.
I think I'm going to be a little bit facetious right now, but have you got an appointment yet with the Minnesota legislature and give them this speech before they get their budget done?
Yeah, I'm not the right messenger. We're using the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce and the St. Paul Chamber of Commerce and the Minnesota Business Partnership is who I'm talking to make the case to the legislature that a first-class business climate means a first-class transit budget. And the idea that we could, either eliminate the budget for transit, which happened in the House of Representatives last week, or cut it, I think, greater than half, which is happening on the floor of the Senate today, that those might be just negotiating moves, or those cannot be the budget outcomes. And it's not only because it's bad for, the future oil-constrained world. It's bad for the present business climate, and I'm hoping that message will get through.
Rhonda Allis with Region 9 Development Commission. One of your slides touched briefly on the renewable energy sector. I have kind of a two-part question. First of all, down in our area, we have a lot of ethanol facilities that have developed over the last 15 plus years. And we always hear the argument about the impact that ethanol has on food prices. I'm wondering if you can give me your opinion on that. And also if you can put into perspective, if the U.S. were to make an impact on locally grown biofuels, I mean, how many acres or how much land would we put out of order in order to be impactful in the development of our locally grown fuels?
Well, that's like a different talk. It's a talk I would love to give, but I'll give you the short version. I'm a person who's tracked the biofuels industry closely, and I'm a biofuels booster. But biofuels have kind of come up against a wall on some of the issues that they're facing, and the next generation of biofuels is what we're all committed to seeing and getting moving. Biofuels that are less dependent on food crops and more dependent on other plant materials that might be either more abundant or less in demand. And I particularly regret that the biofuel controversy has come to where it is right now. And the industry is kind of getting it from two fronts. The environmentalists are angry about this issue they call indirect land use. And roughly summarize their argument is that if we take 100 acres of corn and put it into fuel, then 100 acres of rainforest has to be plowed up in Brazil in order to make that corn to meet global food supplies. That's what I call indirect land use. And farmers are rightfully annoyed that they would be responsible for the carbon and environmental impacts of something that somebody does down in Brazil. So that's one set of controversies. I tried to find a middle path for these groups to talk to each other, but they don't even take each other's phone calls anymore. And the other issue that biofuels is getting from the other direction is assaults on so-called subsidies. And I think it's true that the biofuels industry needs to move toward market pricing away from public support. But I think it's also disingenuous for looking at the amount of public support and subsidies and tax breaks and incentives that we have for drilling for oil, which they don't need any incentives and subsidies and tax breaks. like I pointed out, they're drilling for oil every place they can possibly look for it. And so we have subsidies that we put in place when oil was $15 a barrel in order to encourage development. We're still giving those same subsidies when oil is $100 a barrel. And so some of those same senators who back those subsidies for oil are saying that, oh, we have a deficit, we have to eliminate subsidies for biofuels. So I think the biofuels industry is a little bit under siege from both sides. And what I think is important to think about is that it will be a critical part of the puzzle, but it doesn't change the basic slope of the curve. You can't grow biofuels to be that unidentified sources. It can't be that. Biofuels cannot make up the difference. Biofuels done really, really well can be a part of it. And so the way I think of it is if I have a car, the car I want to buy is a car that runs on electricity around town, but has a gasoline and biofuel engine, so I can drive to Chicago to see grandma. So I never, ever, ever have to buy gasoline, but when I drive to Chicago, I use biofuels. So I use electricity all day, every day in town, and go to Chicago, I use biofuels. And I want to buy the biofuels, and I'm willing to pay $7 a gallon for the biofuels because I'm only use it 3 times a year. So I'll buy the very best, the highest quality, the Cadillac biofuels with all the environmental protection from the best feedstock. You know, I'm willing to pay the price because I only need to drive to Chicago at Thanksgiving and Christmas and 4th of July. I only need it 3 times a year. See what I'm saying? So what the hell does it matter what I pay? Because I'm buying gasoline usually from XL Energy at 75 cents a gallon. So that's the car I want to drive, but I can't go out and buy that car today, but I'll be able to buy that car in the next 2-3 years.
John Huslod, Minnesota Trucking Association. Good to see you. When we talk about personal transportation where there are options where people can choose to get on a bike or car or transit or bus, that's one thing, but freight,
Yeah,
freight is freight.
it's freight. Mm-hmm.
And we're diesel, we're not gas, and we're not going to move away from that anytime soon, although there are attempts, there's research. The challenge is, so how do you address the freight sector
I'm really glad.
that has efficiency issues,
Yep.
that has real, you know, we could literally power big trucks with batteries, we just couldn't carry freight then.
Right.
You know, we could do it, but
I'm so glad you asked that because it was obviously a missing part of my talk. And electrification of the freight sector is not going to be a solution unless we run freight on trains. Running freight on electric trains is highly efficient. We can't run all our freight on trains. I actually think this is a place where the big energy debate had a significant contribution from T. Boone Pickens. And his argument is that we should run 18-wheelers on natural gas. Because one of the good news energy stories over the last 5 years is abundant natural gas. Because, you know, for a long time we debated about natural gas would be too price volatile, you know, it's going to be $2, then it's going to be $10, and it's going to be $4, and it's going to be $13. But now all the wise people are seeming to say that natural gas is going to be $5, $6, $7, maybe in that range for the next 20 to 30 years. So I think that we can now think about converting our 18-wheelers to natural gas and run them on gas. And, you know, he has a little self-interest because he owns a bunch of gas pipelines. But I think T. Boone Pickens actually made that fairly sensible contribution to the national debate on energy last year. And I don't know if it can be done rapidly or gradually, but if you knew that what I was saying is the reality for the world that you live in, and you started to pencil out, okay, oil at $130 a barrel, oil at $170 a barrel, you might realize that, boy, converting to gas really looks pretty good. I'd be really curious to have a conversation with you about that, whether that pencils out in your world.
Any final, we've got time for maybe one more question? Yes.
Philip Schaffner with MnDOT. You know, we often make the quick jump to buses or to transit. And just like trains can handle some of the freight, but trucks are still doing the vast majority, Trains can handle some of the people, but buses are still doing the majority, and buses tend to run also on diesel or on some sort of liquefied fuel. And we often run into a transit funding trap because of how we fund transit. And just as gas prices spike, we tend to now run into operational funding issues because those buses have to buy gas. They're paying more, but they're not getting any more per passenger. So how should we be thinking about transit? Is it an electrification of transit, or is it natural gas, or are there biofuel options for transit? How should we be thinking about transit?
Okay, well, I think my first bias is that we have a pretty good, in the metro area, the 13 counties or whatever the planning area is, I think we have a pretty good plan for rail. And the problem is that we have so little money that we can do one line every decade or so. I don't know if you might correct me and tell me it's every 16 years, or somebody else might say it's every 7. But I would imagine a world where we could say, okay, let's put in the rail system. Let's get the rail to come here to St. Cloud from downtown Minneapolis. Let's get the rail into Hastings. Let's get the rail into Duluth. Let's put the light rail into Hopkins, Eden Prairie. Let's get the whole rail infrastructure, and let's just build that. Let's get the infrastructure in, let the bones of the system, the skeleton of the system, and let's do it in a decade. Let's put it in between 2011 and 2021. And you say, oh my God, they'll never give us that money. Well, would they give you the money if they thought that oil was going to be $160 a barrel? If they thought that it depended on whether our community stayed vibrant or not, would it be worth the money? I mean, I think the problem is that we're in a kind of a business as usual paradigm, and we're in a very disruptive reality. That's the problem. So I agree that buses aren't the be-all and end-all. Buses are part of the system, but I'd like to get the bones of the rail in first. And I also, not to be political about it, but I would avoid very large, wasteful investments. The people of Stillwater desperately need a bridge, but they don't need a $700 million 4-lane freeway bridge, in my judgment. I've seen both the sides of this argument, and my bias is that a smaller, more thoughtful bridge that goes from Stillwater over to Wisconsin is sensible, and getting ready for big suburbs of New Richmond is not sensible. That's my judgment. I could be wrong on this, but that's my judgment. So the money that we have, we should put into the infrastructure that makes us less oil dependent, and we should try to talk to the policymakers about getting the infrastructure in over the next decade rather than over the next 3 decades. Then, as electrification starts to come along and advanced biofuels and people start making automobile choices, the president said that we should sell or buy or have or get to 1 million electric vehicles by 2015. What would Minnesota's fair share of that be? It's a modest number. It's a very small number. But what happens then when those electric vehicles are on the street and everybody's saying, wow, that car doesn't make any noise. What does it cost you to run? Oh, 75 cents a gallon. I'm going to buy one of those. I mean, I have this image that electrification of vehicles could happen very rapidly rather than very, very slowly. They could happen rapidly. So transit infrastructure, encourage transit-oriented development, try to get investment near the transit hubs and transit ways. It's a big menu, but the people in this room have enough credibility and enough influence that if you make your voice heard, that we need to build the transit system for an oil-constrained world. We need to get ready in order to keep Minnesota globally competitive. And this is the other thing I'll say about that is every first-class city in the world has a first-class transportation system. New York, Paris, Montreal, first class. Washington, D.C., go to transit system and zoom. We don't have it. We barely have a start on it. We're behind.
Quickly, yes.
Chuck Marone, you mentioned connecting the rail to St. Cloud, And I just want you to maybe elaborate a little bit on like the Big Lake stop, which is in the middle of a cornfield. Can we continue with the idea that in a changing oil economy, we can just live the same way we do now and basically build parking lots in the middle of cornfields to get on trains? Or is the whole equation have to change bigger, in a greater way?
Well, that's a good question, but frankly, it's a little bit above my pay grade. I haven't done the analysis of that. I know there were arguments that the what are they called, North Star run would encourage more sprawl. I heard those arguments, and I wasn't as persuaded because I think that it actually gets people out of their cars. If for $4 or $5, whatever it is, I can read my paper, do the internet, and maybe I can even convince my employer to. My workday starts when I sit down on that train. I think a lot of people would get out of their cars for that experience, and I don't know if I think getting it to St. Cloud is important. I think having the backbone of the train system in place is really important. When you travel in a country like Germany, all the towns have train service, and trains are part of life. And I think that as we deal with these realities, trains are going to be more and more important, more and more popular. But I take your point about park and rides in a cornfield. Whether that turn out to be but maybe that becomes a hub for development. Maybe Big Lake is a lot bigger than it is now. Maybe because it has train service, maybe 25,000 people will live there, or 40,000 people will live there someday. Maybe it becomes, that's what I call transit-oriented development. It becomes the place to have a bigger community.